Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. This is Season 14, Episode 2. Have you ever wondered what your favorite dish reveals about America's story? Food isn't just fuel, it's a conversation starter, a window into our history. Join me as we delve into the delicious world of food and drink, uncovering the hidden stories woven into every meal. We'll explore how race, ethnicity, and gender have shaped what lands on our tables. Today we're joined by food historian Theresa McCulla, whose work explores these very themes. Theresa just published her first book, Insatiable City, Food and Race in New Orleans, a fascinating deep dive into the Big Easy's unique food culture. Get ready to learn how food tells America's story. Here's my conversation with my guest, food historian Theresa McCulla. Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. Today I'm very honored to be having on the program food historian Theresa McCulla. Theresa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to kind of talk about the beginnings for you. What initially sparked your interest in using food and drink as a lens to understand race, ethnicity, and gender in American history?
I think my initial interest in food really began with my study of languages. I studied Romance languages as an undergraduate and realized pretty early that it was not just, of course, the study of literature, but of places and people and their histories and even elements like humor and slang and idioms. I remember a French class where one particularly challenging assignment was to transcribe a stand-up comedian. And so I was sat in the library and listened, really to the tiniest clues related to what this person, how they were expressing themselves, how they were communicating. And so I think just like the study of languages is essentially about communicating, similarly, food is really about communicating with others. And certainly traveling to study languages prompted further interest in food and drink. And I do remember also one pivotal moment when I was studying in Paris in college. This was spring of 2003, and I walked by the front window of a pastry shop. The pastry chef Pierre Hermé had a shop there.
Wow.
And I saw a macaron. It was a passion fruit and milk chocolate macaron, and it was presented in this window like a jewel in a jewelry store. And it just immediately sent this message to me that food could be something so special that really had lots of stories to uncover.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk a little bit about your experience as an Arcadia Fellow at the Colonial North American Project at Harvard? How did this shape your approach to material and visual culture?
Yeah, so as I was wrapping up my degree in American Studies at Harvard, I had the wonderful opportunity to work at Harvard Library, and they have a project. It's now called Worlds of Change. It was previously known as the Colonial North America Project. And my role there was to read broadly across many hundreds of newly digitized collections. These manuscripts and archives are scattered throughout 15 of Harvard's libraries. They date to the 17th and 18th centuries. And so my job was really to read across them, to think about connections among them. And so I wrote research essays that helped identify common themes. And the ultimate goal was really to encourage researchers and teachers and students to access and use these archives for their own projects. And so, for example, I wrote one essay on the theme of food in colonial North America, and that prompted me to read all these really interesting and in some cases unexpected kinds of sources. So, things like diaries and memoirs, business ledgers, records of financial transactions, court cases that kind of pointed to all facets of food culture during this early era. And so, they included things like list of expenses from the stewards at Harvard College that told me that at the commencement banquet in 1688, the students and their guests ate things like cherries and parsley. There were diaries from colonists who talked about droughts and other extreme weather events. Those kinds of sources might be interesting to environmental historians. And then other things too that I particularly enjoyed showed the ways in which food could be pleasure. These were more than 200 years ago, but there was a diary of a Harvard College student who he wrote simply one day, had some fun eating a watermelon, and also wrote about belonging to the college's coffee club that convened weekly in a student's room. And one night he said, I slept very little all night by reason of drinking too much coffee. So I think, whatever your thematic perspective, these archives, they hold all kinds of wonderful treasures, and it was incredibly fun to get to spend time with them.
Now, you have the double threat of having both an academic and hands-on culinary experience. How has this combination informed your work as a public historian?
Yeah, I've had the wonderful fortune too to be able to work with food as well as study it. And immediately after college, I worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. I was a French and Italian media analyst, and it was a great way to use my languages. But I sat in a cubicle and I found myself eager to do work that felt more creative and more physical. And so I started to work part-time in the evenings for a pastry chef and then also in a restaurant. I asked them if I could just work for free one evening to understand what dinner service was like. And those were both wonderful and very different experiences. The busyness of a restaurant of dinner service versus the kind of solitary work of helping with someone whose job they prepared wedding cakes. But from there, I went to Harvard University Dining Services, and I worked there for 3 years, managing a food education project. And this was in the late 2000s, when, at least in that region, farmers markets were really just booming and beginning to boom, and people were really quite interested in the topics of regional foods and seasonal foods. And but I think those kinds of experiences, and then also going to culinary school too, they really encouraged me to be very interested in the people, of course, who are growing food and harvesting it and preparing it. The physical nature of their work, the expertise that's more material in nature, the ingredients they work with and how they source them. And so I think all of those experiences have shaped the kinds of questions I ask in my research, and also the way I share those answers. And a good example of that is in my previous job, I worked at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. For the past 7 years, I was hired to build a new collection of the history of craft beer and home brewing. And part of that wonderful job was to record oral histories with brewers and maltster and all the many different kinds of people who make up the American beer industry. And so when I sat down with them, a lot of the kinds of questions I asked were about the work that goes into making a glass of delicious beer. So, how would you describe the flavors of these kinds of hops, or how does recipe development work at your brewery, or, what is the facet of brewing that you enjoy most or find most challenging? And, often those kinds of questions gave answers that were very rich in sensory detail, and, I think help preserve processes and tasks that are harder to record in a book or a documentary, for example.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit further. So it's the Smithsonian. You played a crucial role in preserving the history of American craft beer, as you said. And also, I've seen online that you've written some amazing articles on brewing and craft beer historically. Can you share some examples of stories you collected that resonate with you? And also, this must be an exciting time we live in right now, because right now, in the fast, I think, decade, craft beers have like just come to the forefront, and now we have like a plethora of wonderful things you can get out now, all kinds of amazing beers. So can we talk a little bit about that, your writings and your research, and how you've kind of compared it with today?
Sure, of course. Well, and I believe you're based in the Bay Area, and that is a
Yeah.
wonderful, rich area for beer and for the
Oh,
history of
yeah.
beer. And yeah, and when I began that job in 2017, I started with kind of a blank slate, and so the charge was again to build this new collection. And I thought, where could I possibly begin with this story that's very much a contemporary one? That was a great challenge for me. I'm trained primarily as a historian of the 19th and 20th centuries, but the work was to, of course, document and collect the history of what was happening now, what was happening at that moment. And so it kind of felt like getting to work along the whole spectrum of historical and curatorial work at the same time at once and share it. But ultimately, I decided that the beginning of the story was as good a place to start as any. And so my first trip was to the Bay Area of Northern California. And my first and ultimately my last research visit would be to Anchor Brewing Company in San Francisco, but also
Nice.
to places like Sierra Nevada Brewing Company in Chico, to UC Davis, where they have a very long-standing brewing science program. And again, it was a job that I think began with building connections with the person I was meeting, whether it was to sit with them and record a conversation, oral history, but often through the course of conversation, I would kind of have be especially attuned to whenever objects of material culture were mentioned. So if someone was speaking about their work, but then, referenced a particular tool that they really had used throughout their career, or a notebook that they had used to record, their recipes throughout the years in the brew house, those were all things that told me that they would be good ways that captured this person's story that could be used to share their histories in a museum setting.
So I'm very excited to talk to you about your new book. Your new book is Insatiable City, Food and Race in New Orleans. This had to be, just looking at the book, number one, it's a beautiful book and it's very well crafted. Before we get into the contents, did you have some influence on how it looks? It's a very good looking book, and I feel like it's very lovingly crafted to really represent visually the history. And my God, just looking at all the research you did, it's really breathtaking. Talk to me about the creating of the book and approaching the publisher and getting it
Sure.
published.
Well, I appreciate that very much. And I love the cover, and I am very grateful to the designer at the University of Chicago Press. I believe his name is Isaac Tobin, who designed it. And in the course of my research in New Orleans, I found the photo that is at the center of the cover. And for listeners who might be listening, the cover of the book, it's a black and white photograph of a kind of large cafeteria style restaurant. And I found it in an archives in New Orleans, and that particular photo is titled Unidentified Restaurant in New Orleans, early 20th century. But it just struck me as weird and memorable because the photograph, it kind of looks like these long empty tables, which are set. They're ready for diners, but empty. They're just receding endlessly into the distance, and almost like kind of a mirrored effect. So I tucked it away and saved it and thought, maybe I'll be able to use this eventually. And ultimately, I did ask the press if they might be willing to consider converting it into the cover. And so the designer did a wonderful job. And so this photograph is surrounded by beautiful, colorful illustrations of many of the foods of Louisiana. So you see crawfish and sugarcane, coffee beans, which coffee plays certainly a role in the history, fruits like citrus fruits. And so I agree, it struck me as a wonderful representation of the book and of the research too.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about the book. How did you come to pick this topic? And also, I want to kind of ask you, did you get to travel to? Which came first, like your research, or did you travel to New Orleans first? And how did you come to kind of come upon this topic to write about?
Right. Well, I really came to the topic again through my conjoined interests in language and in food. And, I had studied French and Spanish and Italian as an undergrad. I had this professional experience and interest in food. And so ultimately, my advisor in grad school, she said, why don't you buy a ticket to New Orleans, a plane ticket? And I had never been there before. And so I came to it completely as an outsider and a newcomer. And remains so, of course. I mean, every place in the United States and elsewhere has, people who would consider themselves insiders and outsiders. And I'm always, I'm always a visitor still. But and then, I spent a lot of time there in coming years researching the city. And this book in the end, it's really a cultural history of New Orleans and its people through the lens of food. And it starts in the 19th century during a time when New Orleans hosted the nation's largest market in enslaved people. And it concludes in the mid 20th century during an era of civil rights activism and tourism. And I think one of New Orleans' longstanding nicknames is the Big Easy. It's, has long been considered a place where visitors can kick back and eat and drink and enjoy the place's pleasures. But the book really finds a very different history, one that's often very challenging, but not not fully so. There are many histories of resilience and creativity and joy amidst very difficult stories too.
Can we talk a little bit about some of your key findings in your research and how food reflects racial dynamics in New Orleans?
Sure. So, in every era, really, again, as I started studying this city from the 19th century through the 20th, I found this consistent theme that emerged, and that was a repetition of experiences of consuming and consumption that really revolved around both food and people bound together. Um, and these experiences were really always inflected by evolving understandings of race. And so, for example, in the 19th century, I would find that travelers in New Orleans, the way they described the bodies of food workers, of women who were selling sugar and coffee in the marketplace, in the city streets, the travelers tended to compare the color of their skin to that of the sugar and coffee they were selling. During the same era, visitors to the city before the Civil War, they would combine their experiences of food and drink with this booming slave market that was present in the city. And so planters and their wives, they would go to bar rooms of luxury hotels. They would sip sugar juleps while bidding on enslaved people who were offered for sale in auctions in bar rooms. And so in New Orleans, really to a greater extent than in other places, commodities and commodified people, they were really collapsed into single experiences and single places. And even when you fast forward in time, long after the era when slavery was abolished, you find such difficult histories, they've kind of morphed into different forms, into forms of stereotypes and still commodification. And so you might see in French Quarter souvenir shops, trinkets or cookbooks. They are covered with stereotypes of Black women cooking and selling food. And I was just in New Orleans in April, and you still see some of these things in the windows of souvenir shops. And so, really, whether in the 19th century or the 20th, you find that many diners and tourists seem to want the idea of Black New Orleanians in the kitchen and the wonderful food they create. But at the same time, the people who are doing the work are being commodified or stereotyped. And so it's food that really, in lots of ways, opens the door to these often difficult and very challenging histories. But at the same time, as I mentioned, even if food was often a kind of means of subjugation, I see free and enslaved Black New Orleanians in the 19th century, later in the 20th, using food to build lives for themselves and their families, to find autonomy and pleasure and freedom.
Now, I have a lot of friends that are from New Orleans, and we talk about the food from the Big Easy quite a bit. And I've talked to a few cookbook authors. Now, you talked about the linguistics there and how the language is made up of different cultures like Italian and French and others. The food likewise is made up of different cultural foods. What did you find that surprised you when you started doing your research?
Well, I think so. There are certain foods that are held up as easily representative of New Orleans. And the best known of these is likely gumbo. And so gumbo is used as a metaphor. It's kind of a New Orleans metaphor for the American melting pot. If the United States is a melting pot, then New Orleans is a gumbo. And that has really been used. People have used that since the late 19th century to explain the history of the city, because the ingredients in the gumbo, which is this kind of soup or stew of New Orleans, represents people as well as these geographic flows of trade. And so you have rice, which was initially brought to Louisiana via an African slave ship in the early 18th century. You have ingredients like okra. Many gumbos have seafood and other things that come from the Gulf. And so that's one strand that's maybe less surprising, but I think, I'm not sure if many readers will commonly think about other foods like coffee and sugar. Sugar demanded an entire chapter in this book. The third chapter of the book focuses on sugar. Really until the end of the 1800s, Louisiana produced essentially all of the sugar that was made in the United States. And it was the purchase of Louisiana by the United States government in the early 1800s and the ensuing boom of the sugar industry that really prompted, again, this demand for enslaved labor. And so the third chapter of my book looks to the years after the Civil War, when rural sugarcane plantations and then the urban levees, the docks on the river where sugar barrels and molasses barrels were moved and stored. It looks at photography of those places in the years after the Civil War and how tourists and travelers came to watch people work there and to purchase postcards and stereographs to remember those places after they left.
We've often used food as a touchstone in talking about history. I know that when I was young, it wasn't the greatest of history lessons, but we had the Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party, and we had talks about rum and sugar. When you're kind of building a narrative to talk about history using food as kind of a subtext, how tough is that? And are there any kind of obstacles or like do you ever have any struggles with this when you're trying to get across the historical narrative using food?
That's a good question, and I think I've fortunately I've been able to work with food in many different settings. So there's my book, of course, thinking about the history of New Orleans and race, and in that one context, I'll mention too that the long history of the word Creole, which relates to the cuisine, it is also inextricable with the people of New Orleans. And so to talk about cuisine and people and place, that's one mode in which I've been able to do that in the book. But my experience at the Smithsonian too, thinking about exhibiting the history of food and drink, sharing it with a very large public, writing for a broad audience, in the realm of public history writing. I have always found food and drink to be a very, wonderful way to engage readers and listeners and audiences in a conversation about history. And especially when we might be thinking about subjects that can be complicated, if not challenging. So histories of immigration and gender and race and ethnicity. If food and drink are often ways to start a conversation. And, with beer, for example, we could talk about the long history of beer as initially something prepared by women and enslaved people in the home, and then eventually technological changes and immigration from Central and Eastern Europe to the United States helped convert it into a profession that was done primarily by men in factory-like settings. And so the subject enables us to really see changes that are often fairly nebulous and maybe hard to pin down, but can be contained in the histories of food and drink.
As somebody who likes to read about food and food history, I find this to be a very heady time right now. I've been talking to a lot of food writers, and right now we're having a lot of books that would otherwise be kind of confined to academia available through like Amazon accessibly, delivered to your home, and in bookstores now. So it's a very exciting time for me because I love books like yours and other food history books because they're really exciting to me. I just want to ask you if you can comment on this. Is this an exciting time to be a food historian? Because there's so many kind of almost, I, I'll use this term, humorously, but also seriously, like there's some kind of rock star food historians out now, and it's
Mhm.
kind of like a fun time. How do you feel about this as a food historian? Is this kind of an exciting time to be writing about this?
Sure. Yes, of course. And yeah, I agree. And glad that there are eager readers like you and many of your listeners who are interested in these topics too. I think like all academic disciplines or focus areas, they have their own histories. And so, in the 70s or so, you might see the beginnings of something that would eventually be called food studies. And I think I am often asked the question about, why, I think in New Orleans, especially too, I'll use this as an example. We have histories of music in New Orleans, of New Orleans Mardi Gras traditions, of Bourbon
Yeah.
Street. I felt like there was a sustained and serious history of the city's cuisine that needed to be written, and that in part is why I wanted to do that. But why has there been somewhat less attention to food as a subject in certain areas compared to others? And I think scholars have pointed out that on the one hand, food and experiences of dining and drinking, they're ephemeral. They're hard to document historically, to kind of again trap in a kind of formal archive. It prompts different modes of researching and writing. On the other hand, the work of making food, of harvesting and selling it, is often the work of enslaved people or women or immigrants. And I see this certainly in the research that I did for this book. But I think on the flip side of that, what it prompts is a really creative approach to research. And so, this book was written as part of I was in an American Studies program, and so that kind of compelled me to approach it from a really interdisciplinary angle. And so that's why, one chapter of the book again really focuses on photography, and then to get at the earlier eras, histories of people like street vendors who couldn't read or write, who some of them were enslaved or fugitives from slavery. I looked at things like emancipation petitions or registers of free people of color who were entitled to live in New Orleans, or inventories of a 19th century hotel that could help me understand the objects that enslaved people work with in the course of their labors. And so I think creative research like that hopefully makes for wonderful writing that reflects the multifaceted world we live in and our experiences of being in the world. And so that's all to say that this field of food studies, I think, now it's been building for several generations, and we have wonderful bookstores around the country that focus on it, and scholars and students and listeners too. So I do think it's a great time to be in the field.
Given your diverse background and interest in emerging trends, what are some exciting areas that you see for future research at the intersection of food culture and identity in America?
Well, so I do think one area I look forward to a similar kind of um, growth and maturation in the study of beverage history. And again, I've been thinking about beer a lot for the last 7 years or so, but I think there's a lot of potential for a similar kind of growth and creativity in that realm too. And we have great journalism and some wonderful history too. And I think just the kind of volume and pace of research can really pick up in that realm, whether we're talking about spirits or beer or wine or other things. So I look forward to that.
Now, you've been recognized as a leader shaping the future of the beer industry. Where do you see the craft beer movement evolving in the coming years?
Well, that's a good question. And when I would sit with brewers and ask them, they would often try to flip it back to me and ask what I was hearing from people. And I think it's a time of a lot of change in the industry. And so, I saw certainly challenges, especially for kind of mid-size brewers who were bigger than the tiny, single location nano breweries that might serve a very small community, not as big as the very big brewers. Challenging time for the brewers in the middle. But in response to that, brewers are working with all kinds of creative ideas, whether it's foraging for ingredients or opening farm breweries or reaching for historical recipes. I would hear from all kinds of brewers who had interesting projects up their sleeves related to historical styles or ingredients. But I think certainly challenges like the ready to drink cocktails, canned cocktails, or
Yes.
a desire for non-alcoholic beers, or for other customers who want the higher ABV beers still. I think brewers are working hard these days, as they always have, and trying to understand what customers want and how they can best get it to them as well. I mean, some of the lobbying groups who work closely with the brewing industry, some of their focuses are related to right now are expanding access, ways that producers and purveyors can get the product to consumers. A lot of the means that regulate that are still a kind of lasting heritage of prohibition. We have different laws in different states and different localities related to that. But on that general topic, though, one of my last efforts while at the Smithsonian last summer was I flew to San Francisco to collect from Anchor Brewing Company, which, as you and your listeners are likely aware, was unfortunately liquidated by Sapporo last summer. And so I was very fortunately able to fly there shortly before the liquidation and collect a range of objects from the brewery to ensure that its history could be kept safe and can be made accessible to the public. So the business records of the company from the 1800s through the 2000s, we were able to bring to the archives of the National Museum of American History to ensure that researchers could access them. But other things like a scoop from the hop room at the brewery, a sample of tiles from the brew house floor. One of them is in a custom Anchor blue shade, a sample of Anchor beer yeast, wonderful books from Fritz Maytag's former library in the brewery. Those and other things we were able to bring to the Smithsonian to be able to keep safe and to preserve the legacy of this important business.
So I hesitate to ask this of you because you're academic and your works are quite comprehensive and take quite a bit of time for the research. But what's next for you?
What's next? Well, so I currently work at Mars Incorporated. I'm a curator at Mars, and I have quite a lot of wonderful work to do at the moment related to their historic collection. They are one of the world's largest producers of chocolate and pet food and gum. And so, like any collection, they have a wonderful range of objects and documents to organize and preserve. And so that's my immediate focus. Beyond that, I do hope to write something related to beer, to the history of craft beer. Again, I've been thinking about this industry and its history through the lens of material culture now for several years running, and so I could certainly imagine an exploration of the history through the lens of its material culture, through its objects that could help us understand this history of beer. So that's what's likely coming down the pike as I continue to share the histories I have found in this Insatiable City book.
Theresa, I want to thank you for being on the podcast. I've really enjoyed getting a chance to talk to you. Now, for our listeners, we have links in the bio to Food and Race, Insatiable City, Food and Race in New Orleans, and you can get that right now through all major vendors. Theresa, thank you for being on the podcast. I really appreciate getting a chance to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was my conversation with my guest, food historian Theresa McCulla. Her book, Insatiable City, is out now. We have links to it in the bio so you could purchase it. It's a wonderful read, and I think you're going to love it. Please join us next week when we'll be talking to another food writer. Until then, I'll see you at the library.